security camera.
So, that was the surveillance camera from Danganronpa. Danganronpa is a pretty good game, which I've played for the first time recently. I played the first one and the second one. And I decided to make the surveillance camera because it's been a while since I've done any kind of 3D artwork, but also because it's an iconic asset within the game. It is a murder mystery set within a school, second game set on an island, and you're constantly being monitored, yourself and your fellow classmates in the game, through these surveillance cameras. And they are everywhere, in every location, every room. So I thought that's a pretty good asset to make. So let's jump into it. I'm going to go through the process of making the surveillance camera. The first thing I did was go and collect some reference. Reference is very important for any kind of artwork you're creating, whether or not it's 3D or 2D. So first reference I got was directly from the game, as it was based on security camera. So I got screenshots, I went through some videos online to try and find some different ones I didn't have access to in the game with my current save file, and I was able to get some of those images. There were two variants of the security camera, with a ceiling mounted version and a tripod mounted version, so got both of those. I also went quickly into the anime of Danganronpa, because they do have a surveillance camera in that. However, I did discover that the design of the camera in the anime doesn't match the one from the game. So it wasn't that great for what I needed it for, but it was able to let me see someone's attempt at a 3D model of this asset. And then finally, in addition to that, I also just collected some images of some general security cameras. I was able to find some security camera schematics, which kind of helps because you can just have a look in general, how does the camera look from the side, and then I can adapt those possibly to my design. So get all my images, I put them in a file such as an image dump, and then I just make a quick mood board just for the main purpose, so I can just open it and look at all the images at one time, zoom in what I want, compare what I want. And then in addition to that, I also just did a quick sketch based on those references. I did it in my notebook. It's not the best detail in the world, but it doesn't need to. My purpose is 3D. As long as I'm getting a rough visual representation to help me build the asset, it works for my purpose. It doesn't have to be beautiful. Next, for creating the asset, I need to jump into a piece of 3D software. The piece of 3D software I used for this asset was 3ds Max. The way I model is that I usually work piece by piece, and then after each part of the model I change, I'll create a duplicate and keep it to the side. If you have a look here on the laptop, you can quite clearly see the progress of the model and how it's been built up over time. So I tend to go piece by piece of the asset, block it out, add detail. Once I'm happy it's up to the right level of detail, I then move on to the next one. When I'm doing this process, I'm not really thinking about necessarily making everything as optimal as possible. I'm making sure there's enough geometry. I'm usually just checking the topology is how I want it, and then later on I can always go back and remove geometry to make it low poly and to make it more optimal. However, the main reason I keep all these duplicates is just so that in case I make a mistake when I'm modeling, or I mess it up, or I mess up one individual piece, I can always come back to these sections to get a past piece of geometry. There is one thing which I changed with the design, which is if you have a look at the tripod design, the tripod is the main part I didn't like about the asset. Because it just looks so strange. The main part I didn't like was the legs. So on the legs, they're non-adjustable, which means they can't be folded. So what I did was I altered the design to make it so the legs will be able to fold inwards. Just makes it seem a bit more realistic, because if you had these cameras going everywhere and they're all like tripods, and tripods don't fold down, it's really hard for storage. So I feel like just making a slight change like that makes it a bit more realistic. So then once I complete the asset, As you can see here, I deleted the parts I didn't want, then I unwrapped them. The parts I deleted was anything that's duplicated, anything where I can use the same texture for that part, so mainly for the legs, a couple of the small parts on the camera which can be mirrored over, and for the top tripod mount. This helps save UV space, which helps your texturing, which helps it be higher resolution. Once I had all my pieces I wanted, I packed them all together in the UV box where the texture will go. I just use an automatic one first, and then I make it a little bit more packed afterwards. I never use just the first packing, just because it's often not optimal. The only problem I encountered with this model was there was a couple of times where my smoothing groups weren't great when I was making the low poly, but that was just because I was just missing one piece of geometry I needed to. It's okay to have extra geometry or like extra edge loops to support your smoothing group so things look smooth and so you don't get any kind of like big triangles going over your assets. So the final poly count for my asset, I'm not necessarily going for the highest poly asset in the world. So my rule of thumb is if it doesn't affect the silhouette, I don't use it, because every piece of geometry you add obviously makes it more high fidelity, which if you put it in a game would make it, take slightly more resources to run. Polys tend to be much cheaper than textures, but you still don't want to be overkills on the poly count you're using. So what I then tend to do is then make the high poly from the low poly. I separate all the pieces, I quad chamfer each piece individually, and then I add a turbo smooth. It's a quick and kind of cheaty way to do it. It means you're not having to make sure all the geometry is like super clean or anything like that. You're just kind of like getting the geometry on the edges, and then you're just adding lots and lots of polys to make it all look smooth around. And then I'll end up going ahead and exporting both of them in this state. When I export as FBX. I then move on to texturing. So we then need a piece of texturing software. The piece of software I use is Substance Painter. It's easy to use, you get fast results, it's got good workflow. And it's also what I use to do my baking. The way I do it is I just space them out so that they're not baking next to each other, so they get clean bakes. It also means I can check each piece individually and fully rotate around them. For this asset, I had to make a custom cage. I needed it mainly for this piece down here, which was just kind of like indenting in on itself. The way I make my nets is I just take the low poly, I add a push modifier in 3ds Max, and then I export that push modified version. And then I use that as a net in my substance file. I then re-import my low poly, so when it's not apart, when it's all together, with all the parts duplicated as it's needed. Then I go through the masking process. I pretty much determine which different materials go in which different place, so obviously anywhere that's white, such as the body of the camera, I want this yellow. So I just put a mask over. Going on from there, after I've got everything masked out and I've got all the general material style I want, I'll go ahead and modify them. And over the time of making the model, I end up getting this. The camera housing is I went for painted metal. On the inside part, I wasn't too sure if it was painted metal as well. However, I found that just making it a non-painted metal added like a nice bit of contrast between the two materials, so I thought that was quite nice. That metal is the one where I think it was like one of the gun metals that's in there by default, where I didn't really have to change it too much. The one I had the most trouble with was probably the actual yellow camera housing itself. It was easy for me to get carried away and make it a little bit too dirty at times, so I decided to pull back and just rely more on the roughness. One of the things I'm doing is checking my reference just to check that the materials are the right kind of value. The tripod legs were pretty simple. I was able to, kind of like add this aluminium kind of shine. I did the same kind of shine that's on my Amazon Basics tripod, there's these bits jutting out, which you can see obviously on the reference for the tripod. I decided that this would be more of a soft plastic, just because it seems like the kind of thing where it's added there for protection. It's the only reason I could see it being added there. One of the things I like most is the front of the camera here, or some of the sides, where you can see the nice little groove. So obviously I could have just made it so that the camera, like, this was either all yellow or all metal, like grey. However, I decided to just add this slight groove just so it makes it look like they're connecting. Grooves like this are great for hiding seams. So for example, I don't need the textures to line up perfectly because I've just used a normal, which has made it look down, and added a black over it. So if there is any seam over the metal, it's just hidden underneath that groove. It's the same as here. You see this little camera housing here on this little bit. By adding that little bit of normal data down, it makes the transition less harsh. The glass, yeah, so pretty much the glass, I just made it very shiny, and I've just knocked the values up, just put a slight roughness noise over there so it's not completely clean. Yeah, the material on the top I feel like looks the most unnatural just because it's very shiny. This is one though I didn't really want to change because it just is that on the reference, and I didn't want to go too far away from the reference. I feel like changing some of the secondary materials is fine, but changing a primary material wouldn't be the best, just for me trying to replicate the same design. Each camera has monocam on it. So one of the things I did was I put the reference into Photoshop. Photoshop has so many more fonts than Substance Painter. So I found the closest matching one, and then I exported that as an alpha. An alpha is obviously a black and white image that you can use as a mask. I then just used the monocam alpha on this side and the other side. The white text you can't actually see at all. I just kind of need to guess what it says. So because there's so many cameras, I'm guessing that each camera may be numbered, just for the sake of somebody doing inventory or somebody keeping track of each room. So I've just put unit 5 on this for the sake of it, and then the text underneath. It's quite long, but it's not going across the whole model. What do these cameras do? They survey, so I put the word surveillance on there. Actually, yeah, there was one part which I missed when modeling, when I was checking the reference over texturing. So I missed this little part underneath the camera. But luckily, because it doesn't affect the silhouette much, if you're looking from the front, it would never affect it. It would affect the silhouette from an angle, but that's just a sacrifice I had to take. Ideally, I think I probably would have modeled that little detail on, but at this stage, I'm not going to go back to change it, to rebake, because it's just that late into the project, or late into the assets development. As everything was then coming to the end, and I'd done the reference gathering, I did the modeling, I did the unwrapping, I did the texturing, it was time to do my final renders. Yeah, so for this one, I just did some renders straight out of iRay, mainly just because I'm focusing on this one particular asset. I don't quite feel the need to put in an engine. If you're applying for a job at a game studio, it's nice to show things in a game engine such as Unity or Unreal 4. If I was doing an environment for a game, I would 100% do that, but just because it's an asset, I've just put it in iRay. And then I put them into Photoshop. So I've made this asset in a realistic style. Danganronpa is not a realistic game. However, I still wanted to pay it a bit of homage with my final beauty shots. So one of the things I did was, as you can see on the reference, it's got a black outline. So I added a black outline. And it just does add that little bit of extra, this looks like it's from the game. And then from the background, I decided to give it the same background as the character introductions. It's nice because it's got some nice simple geometry and it helps break up the background and definitely makes it a lot more interesting. So I used the background from the anime characters when they're introduced. It says their speciality, such as world's greatest detective, world's greatest basketball player, basketball, baseball player, world's greatest fighter. So speciality for surveillance camera is monitoring, and name, surveillance camera. So I really like that, and then I just got rid of the names and then showed just the tripod only version, a couple of different angles, and then the top mounted version and a couple of different angles. And from there, I'm just happy to say it's done, it's completed. I wasn't really planning to do much more after this, apart from making the video, which I'm doing now and talking to now. So, I hope you've enjoyed the process from start to finish of me looking at Danganronpa, making an asset, and then getting it to these final stages of saying it's done, it's completed, and I'm happy with it. Thanks for watching, and bye.